Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. David Detmer. Dr. Detmer teaches philosophy at Purdue Northwest, and he has a Ph.D. in philosophy from Northwestern University. And he's just published a book on Jean-Paul Sartre called Simply Sartre, and he's here to talk to us about Sartre. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you here. Why don't we start out with some background on Sartre? I think most of us who aren't as familiar with him as you are associate him with the existentialism movement, right? What can you tell us?
Yeah, that's true. He did not coin the term existentialism. That was a term that critics came up with, and at first he wasn't comfortable with it, but he decided to go ahead and embrace it. But he was a remarkably versatile writer, so he not only wrote philosophical works, he also wrote novels, plays, short stories, quite a lot of journalism, and in fact, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, so he was quite highly regarded. Incidentally, he turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature. I think he's one of only two people to have rejected a Nobel Prize.
Yeah. 2.5 if you count Bob Dylan, right?
Well, right. Bob Dylan, I think it was just a matter of not showing up,
right,
Right.
But
you are correct. He was very much associated with existentialism, which was a really hot kind of movement in philosophy. First in Europe, maybe in the 40s and 50s. Later, as work started to get translated, it became a kind of hot thing in America and the English-speaking world, maybe in the 60s and 70s. But now it's kind of widely regarded as somewhat passé, yesterday's news. And so part of what I was trying to do in this book was to argue for its contemporary relevance.
Yeah. But just to go into that a little bit more,
sure.
He wrote a play called No Exit,
yes.
1944. That was part of that movement in some way?
Yes, I mean, he didn't self-consciously create it for the purpose of it being part of the existentialist movement, but it's come to be regarded that way, and I think accurately so because it does contain some of his major ideas. Now, there's an interesting story about how he came to write that play.
Okay.
He had 3 actor friends, a man and 2 women, and they approached him and said, hey, could you write a play for us? We'd really like to do a play together. Could you write one for us? And so he agreed to do it. But then he realized, as he started to think about the possibilities, he realized that all 3 of these actors were rather vain. And so if he were to give one of them more stage time and more lines than the others, there'd be trouble. So I thought, okay, maybe I better have them all on the stage from start to finish. No one ever leaves. No one leaves, no exit. Why would that be? And then he came up with the idea, okay, they're in hell, that's why. Now, Sartre was an atheist. He didn't believe in heaven or hell, so this ended up being a kind of metaphor for him. But that's how he came up with the idea for that play. And so what happens in the play is all 3 of the characters have done nasty things, and they're all worried that's why they're in hell. And so all 3 of them desperately want to believe that they were really good people and they're there by mistake. Yeah. And so each one tries to get one of the other characters to affirm that, yes, I understand, I agree, you didn't really do anything wrong, it really wasn't your fault. Yeah. But the third character in every case spoils it, says, why are you believing that? Don't you see that's not true for this reason or that reason? So they always spoil it. And so at a certain point, they notice, hey, there hasn't been anyone in here with whips and chains, no one in here to torture us, what's going on? And then they realize, each of them is sort of there to torture the others, that the people behind this have been very clever to pick the right people to put in there. So it gets at 2 of Sartre's fundamental ideas. One of them is about human relationships, that people tend to demand of others things that we don't really have a right to demand of them, and so we are frustrated by that. There's a lot more to it than that, but a lot of his stuff about human relationships is in there. And then also, one of Sartre's major ideas was bad faith, the idea that people are prone to self-deception. And so these characters are all trying to deceive themselves. They all recognize that they really have done bad things, but they're trying to convince themselves, that they weren't at fault. And so he thinks this is a major part of human psychology, this tendency toward self-deception, or what he calls bad faith.
Mm-hmm. That's also, it's a kind of a short play, and it's been done frequently, so I think that's probably why that looms so large.
That's right.
His reputation.
Many of his plays are very lengthy. There are some that take more than 4 hours to do. No Exit is a one-act play that takes only about 40 or 45 minutes, and it's an entertaining play. There's lots of humor in it. So it's quite regularly performed. I saw it a few years ago in Valparaiso, for example. Some of his plays aren't really performed that much anymore, but that one is part of the standard repertory, I guess you might say.
Well, in your research and work you did with this book, you found some issues that you think are particularly relevant today, right?
Yes. So in this book, Simply Sartre, I decided I wanted to focus on issues that I thought were relevant today. And one reason for that is there's a tendency to look at Sartre as someone who was important for a period of the past, for France in the 1940s and 50s, that sort of thing, but maybe not important to us today. And so I tried to select aspects of his thought that I thought were especially pertinent today. So I'll mention one.
Sure.
The notion of responsibility. So in my chapter on responsibility in the book, I start off with an essay that Sartre wrote called The Republic of Silence, which is a very short essay, only 3 or 4 pages long. And he starts off with a paradoxical first sentence. He says, "We were never more free than under the German occupation." So how could that be? I mean,
maybe I should just fill in a little bit here.
Sure.
So he was born in Paris, I think.
That's right.
1905.
Yes.
And he's one of the few people who lived in Paris who was born there, I found.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And he was there during the Nazi occupation.
Absolutely.
And I think he was arrested at some point, right?
He was a prisoner of war for a while. Yes.
Okay. So when he's talking about this to the French people, he's talking from experience, and they understand that.
And notice he uses the plural. He says, "We were never more free." So he's not just talking about himself. And so one wonders, well, how can that possibly be? I mean, in every obvious sense, they were less free. They were under, the authority of this foreign occupier.
They might find that offensive, actually, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But as he goes on to explain it, he explains what he's really talking about is the awareness of freedom. That when you're under a difficult situation like that, where every choice you make might have severe consequences, it might result in someone being arrested, someone being killed, and so on. And he even talks about the German propaganda, how it required a real effort to think clearly, to think for oneself, to not be influenced by this propaganda. So there was this tremendous awareness of your responsibility to think clearly, to do the right thing, to help others, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I try to argue in the book is that we're always in that situation. I mean, there are millions of people, dying of starvation. There are all sorts of, there's global warming. There are all sorts of serious problems. And so one can do something about that or not do something about that. We don't, and in a way, this idea of responsibility should weigh even more heavily on us than it did for the French under the German occupation, because we're in a situation where we don't have to worry about going to a gulag or a Nazi death camp or a CIA black site. And so there's this idea, your actions have consequences in the world, your actions affect other people, there's this reciprocity, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's just we tend not to think about it because we aren't under the same pressure that the French were under the German occupation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, he's also concerned with consciousness, and that's kind of a consciousness issue in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Well, yes, although so you're right that I have another chapter on consciousness. There I'm not so much focusing on the political aspects of consciousness. The other chapters on responsibility and freedom are more on that. But consciousness is another important issue because in both philosophy and psychology, I think it has been de-emphasized. And what I mean by consciousness is just awareness, perceiving things, remembering things, imagining things, and so forth. And because consciousness is not something that can be measured, it's not something that can be directly observed, there's been a tendency to ignore it, to instead focus on behavior, which is observable, to focus instead on neurology, brain activity, because that's now observable and measurable. So the whole domain of consciousness, of the various modalities of awareness, that's been kind of a neglected topic. And Sartre is one of the ones who has dealt with it extensively. He wrote a couple of books on imagination. He wrote quite a lot about perception and so on and so forth.
Well, let's look at the other big issue then too, since we've hit two of them, the issue of freedom, right?
Yeah, freedom is the thing that Sartre, the idea that Sartre is most famous for, but also the one where he's been most misunderstood. He's made a number of very bold sorts of claims. We're always free, we're absolutely free, things like that. And people have thought, well, that's crazy. How can he say that? And so one thing that has been overlooked as something that I've emphasized in earlier writings of mine on Sartre, and I talk about it in this book as well, is that in his classic work, Being and Nothingness, he distinguishes between two different senses of freedom, one of which he calls freedom of choice and the other freedom of obtaining. So freedom of choice means, when you're acting, there's an open future. It's not determined which way you're going to go. And he says that's true of everyone in every situation, no matter how dire, even if you're a slave, even if you're a prisoner, you have choices to make.
Yeah.
But freedom of obtaining means something like the actual ability and available means, to get what you're striving for. And there's a kind of evaluative dimension to it where we're going to call someone relatively unfree if they don't have access to sort of good things of life.
Sure.
So from that standpoint, yes, of course, Sartre recognizes that a prisoner, a slave, is not free in the way that you and I are. So I think once you put those two together, there's not this sort of objection that people have. But also, now tying back to the first thing, freedom is very much tied in with responsibility. Because there's this open future, because you have a choice of what to do, then these points about responsibility come into play.
Did he see himself as a philosopher who had this program and all of these things were, connected back to some core philosophy, or did he see himself as an intellectual writer who, delved into this and then delved into that when it interested him? Where was he on that spectrum?
It's more the former, and that is more the continental style, continental Europe. So this is another thing that maybe I should mention. An odd feature of philosophy, my field, roughly dating to about 1900, so only for the last 120 years or so, there's been this split between what is called analytic philosophy, which is primarily practiced in the English-speaking world, and what has come to be called continental philosophy, which comes mainly out of France and Germany, the European continent. And in the analytic tradition, there is more this sense of focusing on very narrow, very precisely defined problems. Whereas the continental tradition is more about trying to see everything in a comprehensive, synthetic kind of vision. So Sartre is more in the tradition of someone like Kant or Hegel, trying to build this whole kind of thing where everything is connected. And of course, that's very ambitious, and no one's going to be able to pull it off without making a lot of mistakes, but that's something he tried to do. And so he wrote these big, monstrous books, one called Being and Nothingness, another one called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, and they're both like 700 pages long and very dense and everything. So that's really kind of the foundation of what he's doing, and then his novels and plays and short stories are working out some of these details in fiction and what have you. I might also mention, I talked about how he wrote novels and plays and short stories. He also wrote quite a few biographies, and some of those have been very celebrated, and he works out some of his ideas there. So for example, he wrote one on Jean Genet, and that was a very unusual book in that he wrote on someone who was less famous than himself, younger than himself, but he used that to work out his ideas about psychology. And that's one of his most highly acclaimed books as well.
He also had a very active life in politics, and he, I understand, he sort of was represented the left, but not aligned with the Soviet Union left, right?
Yeah.
And that got him a lot of grief, I think, from other people. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So way back in the 1930s and early 1940s, he was very interested in establishing a middle path, as he put it. And that didn't win him any friends from anybody. In France at the time, the French Communist Party was a major player.
Sure.
They despised Sartre. They despised him for being anti-Soviet Union. They despised him for his independence, and I think also for his popularity. Here's this other kind of leftist force competing with what they were trying to do. And then on the other hand, you had the right wing who despised Sartre for being a leftist, for being a bohemian, for being an atheist, for having an unconventional lifestyle. So he was involved in a very unusual relationship with another great writer and philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir, where the two never married, and both of them were free to have lots of other affairs with other people, and both of them did. So it was a very unconventional relationship.
We called that free love in the 60s.
Yeah, free love, that's right. So they despised that as well. So he wasn't making any friends with anyone for doing that, but that was the stance he tried to take.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned in the biographical material in there that he had a very liberal upbringing and unstructured to some extent, and that one of the themes throughout his life was his opposition to oppression.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that got him into trouble. You can see it as a theme, obviously, throughout his work, right?
Right.
But it got him into trouble when he sided with the Algerian rebels, essentially. Were they called rebels? I don't know. That were fighting for freedom from French authority.
That's right. So yes, Sartre was quite outraged by the fact that here the French had been under the thumb of Germany in World War II, and yet they thought nothing of colonizing Algeria. And so he sided with the Algerians who wanted independence. And so it wasn't just a case of, this is costing us too much money or anything like that. It was, this is morally wrong. People have a right to self-determination. And so he really lent himself to this cause. He wrote books, he wrote articles, he used his voice, and the pushback was very strong. His apartment was bombed twice, and many of his unpublished manuscripts were destroyed. The office of the journal that he founded and where he was editor, that was bombed. There were 3 bombings. As a result of this, there was a period of time in which no hotel in France would rent him a room because they were afraid the room would be bombed. There was a right-wing terrorist organization who let it be known he was on their hit list. They planned to assassinate him.
This is just hard to believe in France, where they've had this history of having debates about things like the Dreyfus trial and things like that, and where they value their liberty so much. I mean, all the paintings of liberty leading the people and things like that, right?
Yes,
It doesn't fit in a lot of ways as an American, looking at that.
Well, and in fact, it's interesting you mentioned that. There was a book by a man named Henri Alleg, I want to say, A-L-L-E-G, I think that's the name. He was a journalist who was tortured by the French because of his activities for Algeria.
Yeah.
And the French banned that book. And it was the first time in over 100 years they had actually banned a book.
It's got to be bad to be banned in France.
That's right. And so Sartre immediately leaped into action and wrote a foreword to the book so they could put out a new edition with Nobel Prize winner Jean-Paul Sartre's foreword.
Yeah.
And the French initially banned that too before they finally let it be published. There was a left-wing periodical and Sartre did not agree with its editorial line, even though he too was a leftist. This was a different kind of leftism than his. And the French banned the sale of that newspaper. And so they came to Sartre and said, "Can you help?" And he said, "Tell you what I'll do. If you like, you can name me editor. We'll put my name as the editor." And so they did that, but the French still banned the thing. So then Sartre and Beauvoir went out into the streets to sell it. And the police arrested them and brought them down to the police station. They were held for about 90 minutes, but then de Gaulle heard about this.
So Charles de Gaulle is the president of France.
Right.
And he hears that Sartre's been arrested.
He hears
Yes.
that Sartre's been arrested. He says, no, release him. One does not arrest Voltaire. That was de Gaulle's line.
Right.
And so then they stopped harassing the newspaper. So yeah, even in France, where you've got the tradition coming largely from Voltaire of freedom of the press and whatnot, there was this kind of pushback. So
and there's some irony in the quote from de Gaulle, too.
Yes, because the French had arrested Voltaire.
Yes.
That's right. No, I was just going to say, this also goes back to the issue of responsibility. So Sartre had this fame. He was a Nobel Prize winner. And so he had the idea, okay, that gives me some privileges that other people don't have. So I've got to use these. And so that's why if there was a newspaper that was being censored, okay, I'll put my name on the masthead as editor, and that will help them out. So I think that's kind of an interesting idea. It's not just something to be enjoyed. It puts responsibilities on a person, the privileges that they have.
To what extent was he involved in the movements in the 60s?
Yeah, in the 60s, his health started to decline. He was working on a massive biography of Flaubert, one of his predecessors in French literature.
I think Madame Bovary was one of the first books that he read.
That's
Is that
right.
what you said?
That's right.
Book? Yeah.
And so he wrote this thing that was like, 4,000 pages long or something. It's an unbelievable multi-volume work on Flaubert. And he just really was dedicated to that. And he wasn't as active in the politics of the 60s as one might have expected, given how active he had been before. Part of it, I think, it was declining health, so he wasn't out there in the streets as much.
Yeah.
But he did join in with some of the events of 1968. Although I remember there was something that the students, Daniel Cohn-Bendit and everything, had some kind of event. And they invited Sartre to speak, but they slipped him a note right when he came to the lectern saying, "Sartre, be brief," because he was known to go on at some length.
There's another title for a book for you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, students shut down the universities, right?
Right.
In 68.
Yes.
And then they reopened them in a much more restrictive fashion, as I understand.
Yeah.
What was his lifestyle like?
Well, so one thing, it was entirely oriented around writing. He wrote every day for several hours. And this is why he was so prolific. I read a work, there's a whole book of bibliography of Sartre, which is like this thick, a bibliography. And in there it says they counted the number of pages of his published works. And if you take all the days of his life, it turns out he published 20 pages a day. This is including infancy, when of course he wasn't writing.
It's like working on your dissertation for your life.
Right. So he was a big scribbler. So a lot of what we know about his biography comes from the autobiographical works of Simone de Beauvoir. She wrote 4 or 5 volumes of autobiography. Yeah. When he was writing the Critique of Dialectical Reason, he was worried that he was going to die before he'd finish it. So he took massive doses of a drug called Coridrain, which was some kind of like speed mixed with aspirin, ruinous to his health, I think.
Oh my gosh.
And so he's writing, 22 hours a day, this sort of thing. But anyway, back to his lifestyle. So it was very much oriented around writing. He had a very complicated love life, as I was mentioning before. So that was sort of part of it. But really, reading and writing were his main things. Although I thought, here's one other thing that's not widely known. He loved music, and by all accounts was a good pianist and a good singer. So he liked to play the piano for like 2 hours a day, not very widely known. And he liked to listen to music as well. He liked jazz, he liked classical music, and so on. And one other thing about his lifestyle I'll mention is early on, before he became famous and was starting to make money from his works, he mostly wrote in cafes because his room was not heated. Yeah. And so if you read Being a Nothingness, it's startling that he gives lots of examples to illustrate his concepts, and a huge number of them have to do with what's going on in the cafe. He gives the example of a waiter in the cafe. Yeah. He gives the example of having an appointment with a friend in the cafe and the friend doesn't show up, and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
And these were in Paris, and some of these were the same cafes that Picasso was hanging out in, right?
Oh yes, and he was friends with a lot of those cultural luminaries of the time, and they would frequently be in the same cafes together. And Picasso is a good example. Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. David Detmer for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.